Estou passando nesse podcast para dividir uma informação que fez toda a diferença na minha vida. Quer fazer pós-graduação, mas tá impossível correr de um lugar para o outro?
Pois é, ainda mais com o trânsito.
Então você precisa conhecer a educação à distância do Senac. Sabia que é nota máxima no MEC? E tem diversos cursos de pós-graduação para te levar ainda mais longe. 100% online, sem necessidade de TCC e com acesso direto a todos os professores.
Ah, saber isso fez diferença sim.
Inscreva-se já na pós-graduação EAD. Quer saber? Senac EAD.
Desfrute do novo Icon of the Seas da Royal Caribbean, agora partindo de Miami. É o ícone das férias repleto de atrações, com o maior parque aquático no mar e espetáculos sensacionais da Broadway. Com destinos incríveis no Caribe, incluindo a premiada ilha particular Perfect Day at Coco Cay, a aventura nunca acaba. Icon of the Seas, as melhores férias em família do mundo. Acesse royalcaribbean.com/BRA. Aplicam-se termos e condições.
Support for this podcast comes from CDTA, The Eagle, a Times Union podcast driven by CDTA. School is back in session in New York, and we are back with another episode of The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. I'm Jessica Marshall. This week, the second highest court in New York State is hearing the appeal of Nauman Hussain. He's the limo company operator serving 5 to 15 years in prison for the deaths of the 20 victims of the 2018 Schoharie limo crash. We have been producing a limited series podcast on that limo crash this summer. It's called Catastrophic Failure, and you can find it at timesunion.com or anywhere that you get your podcasts. Now, if you've been listening to that limited series, you know that we're about halfway through it, and that we've never been able to speak to either Nauman Hussain or his father, former FBI informant Shahed Hussain. That changed this week.
Oh, hi. Is this Malik?
Yes, Larry. How are you, sir?
We were finally able to reach Shahed Hussain by phone, to speak to this mysterious man that we've only known through his testimony in court documents from decades ago. He goes by the name Malik Shahed Hussain, and he shared some startling news with us. According to medical documents he shared with the Times Union, his son, 34-year-old Nauman, has been diagnosed with lung cancer. He was a little bit hard to hear because of the connection.
Tradition is sons bury father, father doesn't bury son.
Fathers shouldn't bury sons, he said.
So hearing about his cancer was like that. I don't need to bury him. I want him to bury me.
Times Union editor-in-chief Casey Seiler sat down with Larry Rulison and I this week to talk about this development and other things that we discussed with Shahed Hussain.
Hi, I'm Casey Seiler, editor of the Times Union, and I am on the line, as it were, with two of my favorite journalists, Jess Marshall, our multimedia producer, and Larry Rulison of our business department. We are in the middle of the production and release of a multi-episode narrative podcast called Catastrophic Failure, which looks at the Schoharie limo crash. Many of our listeners and readers will be familiar with that 2018 disaster, October 6th of that year, in which 20 people died, 17 passengers in a stretch limousine, as well as the driver of that vehicle, as well as 2 pedestrians who were killed in the parking lot of a country store in rural Schoharie County, just west of Albany, New York, where we are recording this right now. A terrible disaster, the worst U.S. Transportation disaster in nearly a decade to that point. The podcast Catastrophic Failure, at which we are now at the midpoint of, looks into the causes of that disaster, the various governmental as well as business failures that contributed to it, and the after effect, the criminal trial that resulted, and the various governmental reforms that were put through. Now, when you are in the middle of a project like this, you want to be able to move forward down the path that you had been pursuing. About 10 days ago from when we are talking now, Larry Rulison, you received outreach that kind of led to a little bit of a swerve. And why don't you take up the story from here and talk about what happened?
Thanks, Casey. Yeah, I got an email from someone saying they were Malik Shahed Hussain, and he's the FBI informant who we've been writing about for years now, who originally owned the limousine company involved in the crash. His son later took over the business and was running the day-to-day operations when the crash happened. He also tried to leave some voicemails for me, but since they were from a New York City area code, I was immediately kind of dubious about if it was actually him, because we have assumed he's been living in Pakistan. He was also liked to frequently travel to Dubai too. So I was immediately very skeptical about who this actually was and if they were trying to pull my chain, because the podcast has been running and they get a lot of feedback from people in the public. So
Larry, just to make it clear that Shahed Hussain is in many ways kind of the white whale, if you will, of this story. In the Herman Melville context, he is the patriarch of the family that owned the limousine company that put out this decrepit vehicle that was involved in the crash. You have reported extensively on the fact that, as you noted, he had been an FBI undercover asset in the years after 9/11. He was originally scooped up in his own alleged frauds, and then he was turned to federal use by the FBI to present himself as somebody who would eventually begin to propose the idea of a terrorist plot. And then, of course, it was a sting operation, and the FBI would move in. There have been, over the course of the years, certainly defense attorneys in many of these counterterrorism cases have raised questions about Shahed Hussain's integrity and his truth-telling ability. You've been trying to get an interview with him to get him to answer your questions about his history, the family business, his interactions with state and federal regulators of his limousine company, really since the days after the accident occurred. And with the exception of some kind of second or third hand outreach from people around Shahed Hussain, including attorneys, you have never actually exchanged word one with him until this week, correct?
Correct, exactly. He was my white whale, and I figured I'd never catch him. I had reached out to people I knew he was associated with in Pakistan and asked them, "Hey, could you give me his number? Can you pass on some messages from me to have him call me, email me?" And never could connect with him. So when this happened, it was surreal, because I just never thought I'd ever speak to him at this point. It'd been so long. It'd been 6 years.
Eventually, he moved on from you and reached out to Brendan Lyons, who's our Capitol Bureau Chief and our managing editor for investigations. And when the number popped up on Brendan's phone, he had a communication or a phone call or a couple of phone calls with Shahed many, many years ago, before the accident. And so he was immediately able to say, "I recognize this phone number. This is, in fact, Shahed Hussain." That gave us the confidence to then go ahead and say to him, "Okay, if you want to talk to us for this podcast and for the Times Union's reporting, now is your chance." And he agreed. And so on Wednesday afternoon, Larry, you got on the line with him and at long last spoke to Shahed Hussain.
It was amazing. We were on the phone with him for 40 minutes. He claimed, he said he was in Abu Dhabi at the Cleveland Clinic getting care for a really bad cardiovascular problem. He's had some heart attack, at least one, and had open heart surgery at Albany Med back in 2018 before going back to Pakistan. This was like a few months before the crash. At the time, we learned that he had left the country a few months before the crash. We always were very suspicious about why he left and all that. He explained it was all because of his health issues. But it was an incredible interview, and I've been covering him and listening to his words in transcripts from court hearings and all these things over the years. So the second he got on the phone, I immediately recognized his voice. I'd heard his voice in some video I'd gotten in the past, though. But it was incredible. I was glad because going so far along without having actually spoken to him, it's kind of a problem for me.
The first question is, why did he reveal why he decided to reach out now as opposed to 6 years ago, 5 years ago, 3 years ago, a year ago?
Yeah, so it was interesting. So before he reached out to me, someone on pseudonym or a different name sent me this medical document that was from Albany Medical Center regarding his son Nauman, who's now serving 5 to 15 years in state prison after he was convicted on 20 counts of manslaughter in the deaths of all those people in Schoharie in 2018. The trial was last summer of 2023. And so he's been in state prison now for over a year. And the reason Shahed reached out to me, he said, was because he wanted to tell the world that his son was very ill now. And I think he wants some sympathy for his son and maybe some leniency from the court. That document, you normally don't get people's personal health information. So I was totally suspicious about it. It was 62 pages. I've read similar documents in the past. So after I read it a couple of times, I felt pretty comfortable. But then when we connected the dots that Shahed had been reaching out to me to go over this diagnosis his son received, he'd been diagnosed with stage 4 lung cancer that spread to other parts of his body. Then it made sense. And then I think that was the first question we asked: why now? I mean, we've been trying forever. And he actually admitted that he knew I'd been trying to reach him. He talked a lot about how his son is not 100% culpable in the deaths of those 20 people. And so he wanted to lay a lot of blame at the feet of a lot of other people.
And that's sort of in keeping with the defense argument at trial, which was that Mavis Discount Tire, which is a chain store that did work on the decrepit vehicle, was in fact culpable, far more so than they argued Nauman was, because they had claimed that work had been done on the vehicle that was in fact not done, that they argue had a direct impact on the brake failure that was the predicate cause of the crash. When it comes to the crash, what did he have to say beyond, as you noted, his trying to pile blame onto other parties?
Well, he said, and he would speak sort of in terms that, it was my company and my son and I were running it, and I spoke to him every day. So the way he spoke sort of jived with the way it was prosecutors laid it out. But he said, if my son and I, Nauman, he was meaning, had known that the brakes on that limo had not been fixed when we brought it to Mavis, we would never put it on the road that day. We're not bad people. His point was we were duped by Mavis and the store manager that he dealt with. He said the store manager named Virgil Park testified at the trial on behalf of the prosecution, and was grilled by the defense in the case over those falsified invoices. He went after Mavis and Virgil Park, who was fired by Mavis after the crash happened, and then testified on behalf of the prosecution. He laid the blame on Mavis, although he did say his son shared some of the blame. He deserves to go to jail. He should be in jail. He just didn't think that he should have been convicted of second-degree manslaughter because, originally Nauman was charged with criminally negligent homicide and second-degree manslaughter, but he was convicted of the higher charge, the second-degree manslaughter, not the criminally negligent homicide, which carries a much shorter sentence. If he had been convicted of that, he might be eligible by now for parole.
You noted that he said he was now in Abu Dhabi undergoing medical treatment. Before, of course, he was in Pakistan. His whereabouts were always something of a mystery to us. But one thing we are almost positive is the case is that since a couple of months before the limo crash in October of 2018, Shahed Hussain has never been back in the United States, despite the fact that his son was facing criminal charges related to a business that Shahed had essentially handed over to his son to manage for him, and everything else that occurred. There is no indication that you received from him that he, despite the fact that, as you noted, his son has stage 4 lung cancer, that he's going to be coming back to the U.S. anytime soon.
He said that the only reason he hasn't returned, and I asked him, do you have an immigration problem? Are you going to be stopped? He actually said, I don't think I have any warrants against me, which was kind of interesting. I wasn't expecting him to say that. And then he said that it was just because his health is so perilous that he can't travel. He claimed in the interview that just a little while ago, he was doctors gave him 3 hours to live because of his weak heart, and that somehow another doctor stepped in and fixed the problem, and he's sort of not going to die anytime soon. But he says he's too weak to travel, but he claimed that his goal is to come back, be reunited with both of his sons. He's got Nauman is his youngest son. He's got a son, Harris, who's a couple years older, and he wants to be reunited back in the U.S. with them one day. And be back as a family, which I don't know. He was always not around when they were growing up because he was often doing his work on the side for the FBI and traveling to London, Dubai, Pakistan for whatever reason. He never would fully explain, always claimed it was personal business.
He did not want to talk about any of his undercover work for the FBI. You hit him up with a couple of questions related to that, and he said he really didn't want to get into it. Does that sum it up pretty well?
Yeah, but then he also praised the FBI and he praised his handlers. It was very sort of strange. The last I heard was that he had lost contact with them. They didn't know where he was. And we asked him a lot of questions about the FBI and some of the things that he seemed to have done while working for the FBI that seemed potentially illegal. And we asked him very specific questions about his handler at the FBI and things like that, and very evasive.
So, Jess Marshall, multimedia producer extraordinaire, I'll now turn to you. You and Larry have been accumulating this vast pile of interviews and material. You've been doing so much research for months and months to put Catastrophic Failure together. And now, all of a sudden, after 5 episodes in which you have noted repeatedly, Shahed Hussain did not talk. He has never responded to our request for comment. Now, all of a sudden, quite literally in the middle of this journalism, your storytelling, which is exactly what a narrative podcast is, this change, this all of a sudden at least a mini trove of new material. So what is the plan going forward?
It's interesting because we spent so long just really, really, really wanting to talk to him. So I think in the back of my mind, at least, that there would always be the space for that if it ever happened. So we do have quite a bit of retooling of the series to do before we move on. But the first 6 episodes, they're solid, they stand, and it just adds to the narrative. But yeah, I'm excited to see where it goes now that we have this very powerful voice.
Yeah, and I'll reach out to anybody who you and Larry have reached out to before, any major players in this case who have not spoken to us, either not spoken to Larry or spoken in a very limited fashion, decided not to speak for the podcast, that it makes the podcast better. It makes the podcast more complete, more fair, more comprehensive. if you come forward and talk to the extent that you can. And I'm specifically talking to Schoharie County District Attorney Susan Mallory, whose decision-making in this, we have done our very best to try to explain her decision to give Nauman Hussain a no prison time plea deal. And then, of course, everything that she and the prosecution team went through when it became clear that they were going to be compelled to take Nauman Hussain to trial. And you guys have done a great job of explaining all the reasons why Susan Mallory might not want to talk to you or to anybody about why she did what she did. But speaking as a journalist, I think she is doing a disservice to the community. So there you go. That's me talking, not you guys talking.
Oh, I will say that, it's never too late to reach out and, be a part of the podcast. It's not set in stone, as we have shown, in this very segment here. It is possible to blow up the whole story, even midway through the series. So, that's to anybody. If you didn't want to speak before and you want to speak now, the story's not over.
The story, however, is going to be paused for a week. Usually episodes of Catastrophic Failure are released on Tuesday. We will not have a new episode this coming Tuesday so that Jess and Larry can incorporate this interview in a proper fashion and not try to just jam it together. Reporters are always happy to work on deadline, but we do want to do a good job more than we want to hit a deadline when we feel like we can, that it would be judicious to take a little bit more time. So the next episode will come out a week from this coming Tuesday, and I'm sure it's going to be worth it. With that, I really appreciate your all taking the time. I know you've got a lot of work to do. Larry, you were working on a story for Deadline about this interview. So Larry Rulison and Jess Marshall, thanks very much for taking part in this special episode of The Eagle, a Times Union podcast. Thanks for listening.
As Casey and I mentioned, if you are a legitimate player in the story of this limo crash, and you want to talk to us for this limited series podcast, Catastrophic Failure, please email us at podcast@timesunion.com. You can also email us there if you have any questions or comments about any of our other podcasts as well. That's it for now. We'll be back with more episodes of The Eagle soon. The Eagle is a production of the Times Union. It's produced and edited by myself, Jessica Marshall, with help from the Times Union digital team and the newsroom. Our music is Flyin' by Top Floor. Special thanks to Casey Seiler, Larry Rulison, and Brendan Lyons for their contribution to this episode.